Welcome back to the farm. Today, our guest is Jasun Horsley of Auticulture, author of books Prisoner of Infinity, Vice of Kings, and Seen and Not Seen, as well as the Liminalist podcast. And we are also joined by Stephen Snider.
Hello.
So, Jason, I don't really have a horse in this very particular belief race, but I was wondering if someone wanted proof that there's something legitimate to Pizzagate, that there's something really to that, and it's not just a giant internet distraction or whatever. Where would you point them?
Well, it's been a while since I was in that particular quagmire of Pizzagate, and I definitely went through the hazing ritual of it at a forum called Rigorous Intuition, where there was a very virulent opposition to it, even though that's the forum that's pretty well versed and well researched in terms of the reality of organized child trafficking, sexual abuse, pedophile rings, and even organized ritual abuse. So it was interesting about Pizzagate that even people who were generally aware, or at least somewhat aware, of the deep background for something like that were very scornful of Pizzagate. It was very divisive in that way, and I think that was probably deliberate. So that would be the first thing I'd say is that it's definitely not an either or thing. Um, and some
I
of the
felt the same response, not to cut you off, but there were so many people who were versed in anything from satanic ritual abuse to MK Ultra to any facet of the things we look into regularly. And for some reason, I found the exact same response. There was such extreme pushback and denial, as if this particular case just couldn't relate to something real.
Yeah, well, one of the reasons I'd say for that is that it was just a little bit too close to the culture that we can all recognize as our own, even
Mm.
if it's not very specifically, even if we're not part of the sort of avant-garde arty scene or homosexual scene, if I can even use that phrase now, whatever you want to call that, the liberal progressive scene that involves a lot of gay stuff and that overlaps with edgy art and so on. So that was how they were. I mean, that was the context in which a lot of that bubbled up. It wasn't only that. Obviously, WikiLeaks was a major thing, but even with the WikiLeaks, one of the things that came up was Marina Abramovic, who's an avant-garde New York kind of edgy artist, and really is quite well placed within a culture that many people identify with or see as positive, or at
So
least.
do you think it was, I'm sorry,
Yeah, go ahead.
do you think it was too close to the liberal establishment, shall we say? Do you think that there was too much, let's say, weighing on elections and the views of people like Hillary Clinton or
Well, that,
Podesta, that some of the denial was just political?
yeah, for sure. I mean, that was quite overt, wasn't it? I mean, obviously, it was pointing at Hillary Clinton because of Alephantis, and it was in a particular period of it was a particular an unusual degree of polarization already and strong feelings and so on. So I fell out with one of the few family members besides close family that I had any contact with, not over Pizzagate, but over the Trump-Hillary divide, simply for pointing out that Hillary Clinton wasn't a saint, really. Essentially, suddenly I must be on Trump's side, and I was just spewing disinformation,
Yeah,
creating.
I got a lot of that as
Yeah,
well. I mean, I had to argue that, I was not a subscriber to Hillary being any kind of great person or even a politician. I was behind. And the argument would just, and I mean, go on forever there. Well, you must secretly be, associated with Q or something. The other thing I wanted to bring up real quick is just WikiLeaks really brought a lot of light to the correspondence, proving that Podesta was this person that people were having theories about as far as the Rockefeller initiative and related to the nuts and bolts aspect of the UFO phenomenon. And so the same group of documents, the same few hundred WikiLeaks documents in the same day was confirming that yes, Podesta and Hillary had spoken to different astronauts, had spoken to people in the DoD and in other sort of black program areas of the government related to nuts and bolts UFOs. And then, 10 pages later in the WikiLeaks, it was saying that they were absolutely using these pizza related terms to talk about giant parties with children and everything. And I think the latter had a lot to do with the way the election wound up. Not that I was concerned about that, but I found it very interesting that we got confirmation about Podesta. Then Podesta winds up with Lavenda in these photos promoting the first wave of TTSA, let's say, the Stars Academy that Tom DeLonge was running. And I'm sorry if I cut you off again. I just thought that was very strange timing.
Yeah, well, so it brought a whole bunch of other points on the map now, right? There's an awful lot of different points here that intersect. I mean, Prisoner of Infinity does get into the intersection between organized child abuse and the UFO narrative, but it's quite a large area that we need to map to really see how those two things do intersect. As far as what Pizzagate was, I mean, in terms of, I mean, let's bring it back to the specifics, but also to the metaphor, very easy metaphor of smoke and fire. So how much was smoke and how much was fire in Pizzagate? I mean, that's essentially what needs to be determined when you're looking at something like that, because some of the smoke is there just to get in your eyes and prevent you from seeing the fire, and so you come away with the belief that you're supposed to have, which is it's all smoke and no fire, right? Because you've been blinded by the smoke. But actually, logically, if we stay with the metaphor, if the smoke, there is fire. You just have to look, more closely. And with Pizzagate, it's really hard to separate, how much was deliberate and intentional because as disinformation and how much was hysteria. Same with the satanic panic thing, so-called, because it seems like there were both. But even one could even look at WikiLeaks and the way that they zeroed in on John Podesta's spirit cooking and tweeted about blood and urine and semen. It was a bit hysterical, frankly. And then that caused the Washington Post, non-denial or denial that just took the piss out of it, just made fun of it, as in it was so extreme. So you could say WikiLeaks set themselves up for that by, painting with too broad a brushstroke, rather and just appealing for the sensationalist headline, but rather than zeroing in on the visible fire. So with Pizzagate, there was visible fire in terms of Laura Silsby and the child trafficking in Haiti. There was Denard Hasberg, who was convicted child abuser who was associated with the Clintons. There was Majestic Abe, who was on video, Comet Ping Pong, making jokes about pedophilia, child abuse. They weren't jokes. There's nothing funny about them unless you were a pedophile. Those are the only context in which to laugh at those comments if you watch the video. But those things have to be I mean, even that last one, of course, is that's more subjective, what I've just said, right? They're not jokes, they're not funny. I mean, there's a danger I'm getting into moralizing now. I was trying to just be factual there, that they're not jokes. They're just insinuendos about pedophilia that people are laughing at. So, but it's still subjective, you could say, within that climate. They're edgy, they're trying to push the limits. They're trying to be transgressive. Same with the Alephantis' Instagram feed. Some people say, well, there's nothing there at all. They're just completely innocent. The other end of the extreme, they're saying, no, it's proof he's a child, pedophile, member of a pedophile ring. In the middle, although I think the latter may well be true, but in the middle can be an apologist, or it can also be a way to understand better the strategies, which is it's transgression. It's the avant-garde trying to be transgressive. Right? And we live in a culture now where that ideology has been so well spread, so well distributed, that most of us who grew up in this culture, and I know I did, I mean, I have an unusual background actually, because I grew up in a leftist aristocracy, so well into transgression. But even, all of us have been exposed to media and shaped by media that has this ideological bent to it, that that art is transgression, and therefore it's not a big leap to say that transgression is art. And that's a very cunning cover, because it can literally become, no, there's nothing to see here, it's all smoke and mirrors, right? It's not a real fire, they're just joking about being pedophiles, they're not really pedophiles. Which would bring us to Lavender and the kind of games he's playing. And I think this is characteristic of intelligence operatives and psychological operations in general, that they terrorize us while at the same time trying to recruit us, and at the same time, and part of how they do this is to make it seem as though it's all just a stunt, it's all just theater.
Certainly. Yeah, Stephen, I want to let you ask your first question, but I do just want to add real quick that it reminds me, when you're talking about this twofold purpose of the revealing within the comedy, it reminds me of things with Will Ferrell, Tim and Eric, and Dan Harmon. I just recently saw a Tim and Eric skit where Will Ferrell guest starred, I believe. Yeah, and they're laughing about putting dirty kids in cages and owning a child and having him in the corner of your house for just whenever you need something cleaned. And they keep getting more and more abusive and more spotlight on how dirty and how unkept the children are. And this came out at a time when the public discussion was the children in cages who were coming over the border and the way we were housing them. And then there's this whole Dan Harmon thing with Rick and Morty, where one of his first skits was about raping children. I mean, it was a whole little mini movie about raping children. I've had friends come back and say, "Hey, man, reality check. That was supposed to be funny. That was a play on Dexter." And I didn't get it. I just saw a horrible focus on pedophilia, and then that was the whole punchline. So all these things combined, I've had friends who know really, really, as well as I do, the facts about satanic ritual abuse and intelligence organizations. Basically, everything you were just explaining, all the way to maybe the real aspects of Pizzagate. But those same friends were saying, "Hey, man, don't go there. This is obviously just funny." Will Ferrell's done two different skits where he's initiating people in some sort of black mass that's just way, way over the top and still has no other comedic objective. It's just to show all these things we associate with the Illuminati, or that art directors put in rap videos now or whatever, to be pseudo Masonic and pseudo suggestive in an occult way. And then I know most of those rappers aren't actually in a secret society. It's their art directors and everything trying to be edgy. But the thing with Will Ferrell, and I mean, Dan Harmon freaks me out the most. I want to believe Will Ferrell is just a lifelong comedian, and there was some bad taste in these skits and jokes, but they seem to be way too legitimately Marina Abramovic, however you say that woman's name, than it is comedy. I'm sure you get my point. But Stephen, if you wanted to go into your first, the other thing I wanted to ask was how you currently feel about Lavenda and the TTSA, but that was my last question. We just kind of went into it. Stephen, if you have anything that we've already
Yeah,
passed up, or
well,
yeah.
it was kind of also to weigh in on Pizzagate too. I mean, yeah, I definitely think, the prospect of disinformation and that was very high, and it kind of reminded me really similar to what had happened in the UK with Operation Midland. Of course, that was initiated in the aftermath of the Jimmy Savile scandal, and basically, from what I can recall, the main informant for this was a guy named Carl Beach, I think, or something to that effect. And essentially, this whole thing seems to have been set up almost for failure. Beach had accused Harvey Procter, I believe, of being involved in some kind of pedophile ring, and eventually these allegations were disproven in court, and Beach, I think, had actually ended up going to prison over this or something to that effect. So, I mean, it was kind of a clever sleight of hand where on the one hand you had the Salvo allegations coming out and, so much truth to it, and then you just sort of had this Operations Midland, which, was kind of set up as a failure almost, with an unreliable witness who ends up going to jail. And on the one hand, I mean, it's kind of signaling to the public like, well, you can't take all this stuff too seriously. I mean, obviously there's a lot of kooks out here making allegations, And then on the other hand, you see a whistleblower essentially being imprisoned for this as well. So, I mean, it's kind of a subtle warning, too, to anybody else who wants to come forward as well. And in the case of Pizzagate, I mean, that ended up also getting kind of tied in with a lot of the speculation with Anthony Weiner and the images that were found on his laptop. And the guy who had eventually, I believe, kind of linked all of this together was none other than Eric Prince, the founder of Blackwater. So, I mean, Prince is clearly, a high-level intelligence asset who's been kind of running a lot of this stuff for, private intelligence networks and what have you. So, yeah, I mean, you definitely have to wonder how much of this was sort of an orchestrated October surprise or something to that effect. To get at the Clintons. I mean, certainly it does seem like it had kind of changed the landscape a little bit when it first started to come out in October, going into the elections a couple of weeks later. And again, this isn't to say that, like Jason was kind of saying earlier, a lot of times when there's smoke, there is some fire there. But yeah, I definitely would remain somewhat skeptical of what was going on with Pizzagate exactly and what the actual purpose was, especially when you see a guy like Eric Prince kind of lurking in the background as the champion of trying to get, the New York Police Department to investigate the Weiner allegations or something to that effect.
Sure.
But yes, getting into the question. So first, Jason, I wanted to ask you about Tim O'Neill's Chaos book. I've just about finished that. I think I've got about 35 pages left. I know you're working on an epic book right now on Charles Manson, so I was just curious if that was one of the sources that you had looked into and what your take was on it.
My epic book is actually on Hollywood, so it had to include Charles Manson, or even that was a kind of last minute decision. And of course that opened up a whole can of worms. So yeah, I read Chaos in order to research that, and I was specifically looking for the connections between Charles Manson and Hollywood elite, which, as you probably know, are quite legion and were quite well suppressed, including the rumors around Polanski's complicity or involvement with forms of abuse and even celebrity porn, making films, S&M films, and this kind of thing. Which, anyway, so that was what compelled me to read Chaos. What did I think about Chaos? I thought it had. I mean, there's different. I have different impressions of it. One is the very positive, which is that he seems to have done a very good job turning over a bunch of stones that haven't been turned over before, most especially around the period that Manson first came out of jail in March of '67 and the Tate killings, while he was on parole with this guy, Smith. I forget his first name. There's two Smiths. I think it's Roger Smith and another Smith. Anyway, there are these two Smiths, one of whom was his parole officer, who was
Roger.
Roger, thank you, was also the father of, the foster parent of Manson's first son, Michael Valentine.
Yes.
Right, and apparently, according to O'Neill, anyway, Manson was his only client as a parole officer, which is unprecedented. I mean, it's just absurd, right? Parole officers have many clients; they don't just have one. And he gave Charles Manson, a gold star every month, or however that works, right? Even though Manson was bouncing around, getting up to all these things and building his little army and all the rest of it, right? So obviously that's a major piece of information that I hadn't come across until O'Neill's book. And then perhaps even more striking was the Haight-Ashbury Medical Clinic, where the other Smith was, and they were doing these experiments with rats and speed and so on in terms of, and the Manson was apparently spending time there. But I just cite that as an example that there's something remarkable just about that fact that I hadn't come across some of this information, which was very, like 20 years ago when I wrote Lucid View under this pseudonym Eos Capers. My premise essentially in the chapter on Manson was that he was a Manchurian candidate, that he had been handled by the CIA and he had been mind controlled and then unleashed. Now, it was a very loose and you could say untidy or lazy even thesis. I didn't back it up the way that you, Stephen, you do this very point-by-point data-based research, and I just had this very strong intuitive sense, and maybe I got something from Mae Brussel too. I think I had, so I'm not saying I dreamed it up entirely alone, but in the 20 years since then, I hadn't come across anything like the evidence that Tom O'Neill presents in his book. So that was my first impression, was, wow, he really has turned over some stones here and dug up some unusual dirt. My other impression is not so positive, but this might again seem a bit subjective, but I'm going to include it anyway, because I do think that the medium is as relevant as the message, to quote old McLuhan, and that is that it seemed as though the book was a 20-year opus by which Tom O'Neill was trying to pit a new narrative against Bugliosi's narrative, and that there was a personal element in that. And there was a kind of irony, because one of the things Tom O'Neill was attempting to do was expose Bugliosi as a fabricator who'd created this narrative about the Manson family and then put himself at the center of it as the hero, as the folk hero, as Tom O'Neill puts it. And yet, actually, in a certain sense, Chaos is a bit like that too. It's this new narrative in which Tom O'Neill is there at the center, and he's the dogged folk hero who's uncovering all these truths, and he's dethroning Bugliosi. So it's a bit of a killing the king kind of thing going on in that, and that it does make me a bit skeptical if we then put that in the context that the book was published by Little and Brown, was reviewed by The Guardian, obviously getting major press, it's selling really well. It seems as though this new narrative has been sanctioned from fairly high up. So then that does raise some questions there for me.
Absolutely. And I think I might be able to help you a little bit with your Hollywood research here with some of the things that I was able to dig up in reading it. I don't, want to throw shade necessarily on O'Neill or not, but he did make some interesting revelations in the book that I really don't think that he began to understand in the slightest, or intentionally not fabricated, but tried to confuse the issue. So let me get into this here a little bit. All right. So Polanski's social scene had three kind of curious drug traffickers. They were called Pick Dawson, who was the son of a U.S. State Department diplomat, I believe, Billy Doyle, and Tom Harrigan. And all three of these guys were also involved with another guy who was called Charles Taku, who had been an ex-Marine who had been active in this kind of drug scene in Hollywood, LA area since at least the 1950s. Now, Doyle kind of gained a bit of infamy in that he was allegedly the drug dealer that had been whipped and sodomized at either the Polanski residence or some other nearby by Sebring and what's his name? Frykowalski?
Yeah, Frykowski. Yeah.
Frykowski. Okay. So, yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of allegations about that video for years and so forth. But I mean, for me, the really interesting connection was with Toku, who would also go on to claim that he had been working for some branch of the U.S. Security Services. And specifically, his contact was a Polish immigrant named Hank Fine, I believe. Now, O'Neill was able to dig up some pretty interesting information on Mr. Fine. First off, that he had been involved with the military intelligence service during World War II, and then he had somewhat incorrectly linked that to the Office of Strategic Services, which isn't entirely accurate. Actually, the MIS had begun as a division of the Military Information Division, the MID, and that's kind of an interesting story in and of itself. The Military Information Division had been erected initially during the Philippines War at the end of the late 19th century, and it had been highly effective counter-organization in the Philippines, and quite a brutal one. Now, when the war had come to an end, most of it was shuttered, but the kind of guiding force behind it, a man named Ralph Van Diemen, who's kind of considered the father of American military intelligence, would keep pestering the War Department, and they would keep a sliver of it active until the First World War. And at that point, Van Diemen massively expounded the MID. And one of the big outcomes of this was he essentially erected a network that is usually referred to as industrial security. Now, going into the First World War, there were a lot of German immigrants, recent German immigrants, and there had been a lot of concern over the possibility of sabotage and what have you at factories and so forth that was essential to the war effort. But uh, as the war progressed and it became kind of inevitable that the United States would prevail, a lot of attention shifted to the communist revolution that was beginning to break out in Russia. And this led to a period that was known as the First Red Scare in the United States. This would have been about 1920 or something to that effect. And that got the MID and a lot of its networks into a great degree of controversy. And that had to do with a lot of the civilian auxiliaries or something to that effect that they had erected. And one of the most notorious of these was known as the American Protective League. This was basically a vigilante organization that the military had set up that was used eventually as strike breakers to infiltrate labor unions and so forth. And it was mostly comprised of military veterans and so forth. And this was extremely controversial, to put it mildly. It eventually led to Van Diemen getting drummed out of the military in the early 20s. And for a while, there was an attempt to mothball this network, but it was reactivated in the I think it was around 1927 or something to that effect. By this point in time, Van Diemen was a private citizen, and pretty much all of this stuff was done in a private capacity. He started amassing an enormous amount of files on Americans that were shared with various corporations and so forth, as well as the military and the FBI. So getting into the kind of Second World War era, a lot of this stuff was reactivated, and Van Diemen's network was actually instrumental in rounding up a lot of the Japanese in internment camps and so forth. And then around the same time, you had the rise of the Military Intelligence Service, and that was due to the Counterintelligence Corps, the famous CIC, which Van Diemen had originally set up in the 1920s as part of the Military Information Division. Now, when the CIC, it was known as the Corps of Intelligence Police initially, and then it was redubbed the CIC in about 1941-42. Now, the guy who took over this outfit was Garland Williams, Colonel Garland Williams, who had been involved with the Federal Bureau of Narcotics for many years, and he was very close to George Hunter White, who would eventually become involved in the MK Ultra experiments with Operation Midnight Climax and so forth. There's been a lot of speculation that Garland was also involved in this. Certainly Douglas Valentine has a lot of compelling information on this in The Strength of the Wolf, and obviously the late great Hank Albarella also did a lot to chronicle Williams' involvement in A Terrible Mistake. But anyway, Garland was who had set up this military intelligence service that Vine was supposedly a part of, and it was initially meant as a detachment of the Counterintelligence Corps. These guys were trained at Fort Ritchie, and for that reason, they were kind of dubbed the Ritchie School. And these guys learned lots of different foreign languages and so forth, and this was so they could infiltrate, these circles behind enemy lines and so forth. They could help with interrogations of captured Germans and that type of thing. So a lot of this was very clandestine work and so forth. And the CIC, of course, had also been one of the first agencies to really use drugs as a means of interrogation. There was a specific CIC unit that was dubbed the Rough Boys that had really specialized in this. And there were some other curious figures that came out of this Ritchie School as well that Fine almost surely would have been a part of, most notably J.D. Salinger, the author of Catcher in the Rye. So anyway, this whole industrial security network was reactivated essentially, and then going into the post-war years, it was basically initially it was unveiled with the blacklisting in Hollywood. Van Diemen had been based out of San Diego for many years, and he was actually the guy who had provided the House of Un-American Activities a lot of the information on the Hollywood types that were initially targeted by HUAC in the late 40s and the early 50s until McCarthy had really discredited the whole process. Now, none of this went away. It just went underground, and the big agency that directed this, I shouldn't say agency, it wasn't any official government capacity, but the organization that really directed a lot of this was the American Security Council. They started compiling just massive amounts of dossiers on Americans and so forth. And pretty much anybody that was going to get involved in any kind of industry related to defense in any capacity would have been screened almost inevitably by the ASC. They had just mounds and mounds of files on all kinds of Americans. I think at their heyday, they had collected, 4 or 5 million of these dossiers or something to that effect. And looking at some of these guys like Fine and Taku and what have you, who were hanging out with the Polanskis, I get a strong sense that this was somehow related to this industrial security network, because the major figures who were used for this were military veterans and reservists. Van Diemen, for instance, had worked very closely with the California National Guard in the late 40s and the early 50s on compiling dossiers on Hollywood types. And when you look at the fact that some of these guys were involved in drug trafficking, well, that's a really easy way to dig up some dirt on Hollywood producers, on stars, and that kind of effect. I mean, certainly if you're selling them drugs, it gives you a bit of compromising information. And then when you get into some of the stuff that the Polanskis were reputed to be involved in with, sex tapes and this kind of stuff, it also, it would put a lot of bit of blackmail material on film that's, some of these guys might have been very aware of its existence and so forth. So that was, to me, a really, really interesting aspect of all of this. And obviously, O'Neill really didn't do anything with it. As I said before, he had even associated the military intelligence service with the OSS, but in reality, it was more of a counterintelligence corps operation. And certainly a lot of this stuff had continued well into this period in the late 60s, early 70s, when the Manson thing was really at its height. So, yeah, it's definitely a very interesting lead that he turned up, and certainly one that he did not pursue at all.
Right. So I guess, yeah, we said there's two things going on there. One is, I mean, he's done a good job uncovering certain leads for you or I or for others to follow up, but the actual narrative he's created seems somehow trying to think of a polite word for it. Acceptable to the mainstream. It's not, it seems as though it's, I mean, maybe I'll just turn this into a question. I mean, what do you feel that the narrative that he's creating in Chaos is? Because he's simplifying it. I mean, he's got all these data points, and what you've just summed up right now, which of course could turn into a whole other chapter in my book if I let it, which I won't. But I mean, it's the deep background. And it's very difficult to make a narrative. Like, the more data points you start to look at and follow, the bigger the narrative gets, right? The map starts to get so big that it's as big as the territory. And so that can be crippling. But I think that one of the ways in which it's possible not to be crippled and to somehow still be able to grapple with this is to allow for the ways in which the thing being mapped is all around us. It really is absolutely like the water that we're swimming in, like the culture that we've been created and that has been created around us and that we've been recruited into creating and co-creating. So the deep background that you're providing there, just that spiel of facts, which is very relevant to what I'm trying to the interpretation that I'm trying to present with the book I'm working on, is that Hollywood and the entertainment industry is inseparable from something much deeper and darker that incorporates intelligence operations and agencies going back decades and organized criminal groups and so on and so forth, right? And that is that's very difficult for people to come to grips with, but part of the reasons it's difficult for people to come to grips with is because it doesn't isolate a particular faction to identify and isolate from the culture and say that's what was going on. It's everywhere, right? Whereas it seems as though Tom O'Neill's thing is somewhat congruent with a very particular narrative that has become more and more known, which is MK Ultra, and that somehow part of that, the revelations about MK Ultra that are becoming more and more widespread, is to separate something out from something much larger, and see it as somehow under control. Even, in a literal sense, MK Ultra, the general belief is that was then, right? It's not going on now. So that's a very literal equivalent of what I'm trying rather clumsily to articulate here, which is that a narrative that successfully arranges the evidence in such a way that it can isolate it from the world in which we live is considered acceptable because it's actually not threatening to people's complacency. It doesn't really cause people to question in a deep way.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I mean, to me, the thing that was frustrating about O'Neill is, like you're saying, he did kind of focus in on the MK Ultra thing without really looking at the broader connections and so forth. I mean, of course, if he was more astute on Project Artichoke, he probably would have seen the rather overt connections with these, you know, kind of industrial security network I'm outlining. Because again, one of the big figures for this was a man named Lee Pennington, who had been an FBI agent, and then he would later take over the American Legion, which was another veterans organization that was just used for decades for intelligence gathering purposes as strike breakers and so forth. And Pennington eventually ended up in the ASC, the American Security Council, in the 50s and would work there until the early 70s. He was really the head guy in compiling these dossiers. Now, Pennington had a CIA contact who he was very close with, a man named General Paul Gaynor. Gaynor was the essential head of Project Artichoke. Morris Allen ran the day-to-day operations, but Allen reported to Gaynor. And Gaynor was also a sexual blackmail specialist extraordinaire. He maintained a collections of files in the CIA that were dubbed the quote-unquote fag files, because essentially they chronicled various homosexuals in highly placed positions in the government and industry and so forth. So, you know, you kind of see all this stuff converging with the Manson family, not just with the behavioral modifications experiments, but with blackmail operations, with industrial security and so forth. And as you're saying, I mean, he really just kind of focuses on this one strain and doesn't look at the bigger picture, so to speak. And certainly, if you do consider the bigger picture of it, I mean, it's truly just disturbing on so many levels beyond just the simple mind control or that type of thing. But I mean, the prevalence of blacklisting and so forth. And not just that, but the reality that Hollywood was essential to the military-industrial complex. I mean, this had become blatantly obvious by the late 1930s when Hollywood had just become so pervasive in the American psyche. I mean, up to that point, radio dramas and that type of thing had really been the prevalent form of entertainment. But going into the Second World War, Hollywood had really emerged as the undisputed you know, force shaping culture in this country. Certainly a lot of people were aware of this in the military industrial complex, and it was something that was lumped in with this. I mean, that's why blacklisting did become so pervasive in Hollywood in the late 40s and so forth. And after a brief, you know, run of this in official capacity with the government, it all went back underground. And, you know, we can kind of still see traces of this playing out with the Manson killing several decades later.
It seems to me there's almost these layers that only the most exotic and not so well respected mind control researchers have been trying to tell us. I'm thinking particularly of Fritz Springmeier, the idea that you mind control a bunch of children, that you also have in your catalog of children to be sexually abused. So you own them to an extent, like the Mickey Mouse Club. Let's just say, as an example, that I can explain this whole thing from. So you have a bunch of kids that you're promising their parents, and you're promising them, and you're giving them money, and you're promising them a career, and then whether their parents know about it and are totally part of the pedophilia or the sex slave rings, or whether they have no knowledge and you're just doing this every day when they come to set to work on a show or something, or a movie. So you're abusing these kids. You're using mind control formula to make them these perfect, all performing, you know, Britney Spears, Katy Perry, Justin Timberlake types, let's say, that come from the Mickey Mouse Club. Then you're using these mind controlled doe-eyed actors and singers to then project out a program of mind control to the whole populace. So it's like these people are so under your thumb that you write the shows, you come up with the symbolism, you come up with the lyrics to their songs, etc. So you have them so well under control and maybe not even conscious of it, as far as multiple personality disorder, or DID, may function in this context. And then that's used to kind of program the rest of us. And maybe I'm making too many connections and going too far with it with things we don't have great sources for, but I feel like it's almost obvious on a lot of levels, from where Hollywood started to where we were with the Mickey Mouse Club, let's say in the 80s and 90s, to now watching these people all be individual musicians or artists or whatever you want to call them, and traveling the world and still kind of, blowing the trumpet of whatever that the guy who played an instrument to attract kids in like medieval times, the Pied Piper kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think there is a problem in creating narratives too quickly, as opposed to what Stephen does, which is just lay out data points and kind of let the person come up with their own narrativization of it. And I think Springmeier is somebody that I would not consider a reliable source, which doesn't mean that much of what he's saying isn't true, as I'm sure both of you are well aware. Disinformation is usually mostly true, but it's that part that isn't true that makes the whole thing untrue. And sometimes that part can simply be the person who's delivering it. The way that they're narrating it somehow distorts it. And what I've found personally, like this book I'm working on, which is essentially trying to make the case you just made there, Frank, and not only, but I'd say that's very central to it. I do actually believe more or less what you said is probably true, but as you know, there's a lot of websites and people out there who are claiming that's true, and they're not credible. And they're not credible for a reason. It's not just because it's hard to believe, it's because they don't really know what they're talking about, right? Either because they're so damaged by it, or they just picked it up somewhere else and they're spewing it, secondhand.
Yeah. And I find that precisely because it helps people not subscribe to any of the ideas. If you have a few eccentrics or severely abused people out there trying to just tell their half, or what their memory tells them what happened genuinely, still isn't going to be what actually happened. I'm sorry, you were saying?
Yeah, and of course, if they truly have been traumatized in a way that has kind of programmed them, this could well be part of their programming, is to become disseminated as unreliable witnesses. Anyway, what I was wanting to present as a counterpoint was my experience writing this book, which proceeds, as with my previous books, is gathering the data, and obviously I'm selecting and arranging the data. I'm not claiming it's not biased. Of course it is. I'm looking for specific data that will support my thesis, but essentially I'm trying to just present the data and then sum up as I go here and there. This is what this looks like to me. And what I've found reading back over this manuscript, which I've done 3 or 4 times now, and I read it out loud to my wife, is that I find it almost impossible to believe my own thesis. I find it almost impossible to believe the evidence itself. If you point by point, the evidence is I'm referring to mainstream sources. I'm not going to much to testimonials of survivors, for example. There's a little bit in there, but basically I'm referring to mainstream articles and biographies and so on and so forth, and what is accepted in the mainstream, which isn't controversial, isn't being contested, but compiling it in such a way that the argument builds and builds and builds, and then I interpret it, and the interpretation is persuasive. But what I experienced then is a visceral sense of disbelief. I cannot actually believe that this is true, and so that suggests to me that the kind of brainwashing that we're subjected to is very profound, and that because of that, narratives such as Fritz Springheimer, how you pronounce it, or summations such as you gave, Frank, they don't actually, they're not effective in terms of causing us to unsuspend our disbelief. We just flip back into suspending disbelief and believing in Hollywood again, like I do.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter how many times I look at this evidence, I still, when I watch a movie or I listen to somebody in Hollywood talking, I still find myself believing, and then I think this person couldn't possibly be part of the kind of stuff that I know is going on. Like I literally have that thought, and then I start to worry that I'm spreading disinformation, even though I'm pretty sure I'm not. So that
I've been through those steps repeatedly as well.
yeah.
I think that one thing that helps the disinformation side of this so much is the only researchers who have actually published books that vary from talking about the Disney Club to attempting to explain whatever monarch is in the big picture to connecting the end of the world with people programmed like super soldiers programmed to know the safe places to go when stuff hits the fan, so to speak, and on about where to pause Wizard of Oz to see MK Ultra cues and things about the actors and their parents and their relation to these pedophile rings going back so many years. All of these researchers, from the people talking about the Super Soldier Black Awakening, all the way to the Mickey Mouse Club or Fritz Springmeier himself, also want you to swallow 25 to 50% of just pure Christian fundamentalism. So the only people to dig up this stuff and be brave enough to actually publish it in books and actually discuss it regularly on their podcast, even if it only existed in, remote few months in the 90s or something, are people who also want you to swallow things about, Jesus being their ultimate savior and just the most textbook ridiculous, cheesy Christian fundamentalist kind of American, opinion or worldview. And so that immediately makes, I don't know, people like us, certainly me, want to throw the baby out with the proverbial bathwater or whatever. But again, I see all this evidence from other places, as you do, and I see so many facts aligning with the stuff they're saying. And then I just go in and out of, well, even if it is true, why do you have to try to share this with other people? Why do you want to get everyone down with the darkest, most evil parts of humanity and whatever? And then I go back to, wait, this is our whole culture, a whole media. This is people singing these songs every day and forcing their kids to watch this like it's the most healthy thing and whatever. And if it's all programming, well, I have a right or some minimal responsibility as someone who spent enough time purging myself through this data to share it, maybe help other people out or help other people see what I see or what others have even proven. And then I go right back to, oh no, they can't, Will Ferrell is a good guy. He's made me laugh 2 million times and just made 2 skits that made me question or made me relate to this whole quote unquote conspiracy thing. And I go through those exact same cycles you're describing.
Yeah, well, I think that's a useful experience in and of itself, in that it allows us to see that we are divided within ourselves, and that's the nub of it for me. That's like, how have we been divided? It's schismogenesis, it's even a term. Gregory Bateson developed it, schismogenesis, for the OSS. So I mean, it's a specific method that's being used, and we can see the evidence of it in our own psyches, and that's the place where we know for sure, right, that what we're dealing with. That's the one place we can be sure of, is our own consciousness, right?
Sure, and our experiences, hopefully we can take some of them and depend on them to an extent,
Yes, and sort of paradoxically, the one thing we can become more and more sure of is that it's very hard to be sure about anything, even within our own consciousness, that if we're divided against ourselves. And this is a Christian principle, that Satan works through us and works on us internally. You can take it as a metaphor, as I prefer to, or you can take it literally and end up probably barking mad. I mean, like poor Fritz Springmeier, but either way, it is a lived reality, this internal split. And I think, I don't know how Stephen feels about this, but for me, focusing on the dark side of humanity and society, as you put it, isn't just about trying to, or it isn't even primarily or even at all about trying to expose the levers of control and wake up humanity. It's, although I do feel that we're all in it together, it's about using it as a mirror by which I can see the ways in which this cultural engineering, mass mind control has reshaped, reconfigured my entire psyche. So the more I can map it outside, the more I can then see, recognize that imprint on my own psyche, and then I believe that dissolves the imprinting in the psyche, just the act of seeing it. But if not, even if not that, I can at least start to discern, oh, wait a minute, that thought I'm having or that behavior is one incepted in me, by early Clint Eastwood movies when I felt bullied and lonely as an adolescent, etc., etc.
Mm-hmm.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of it for me too is just trying to understand things, and I mean how the world, is the way that it is, and how contradictory a lot of the things that we kind of embrace as social norms truly seem to be, and just in general the pervasiveness of corruption in our society and how it got to be that. I mean, really, a lot of this, definitely started with me, at least trying to, just trying to teach myself these things and understand like why the world was the way it was. And it only gradually became more of an effort to share this information with other people, where it was like, okay, on the side, maybe I can do something positive as well and trying to educate people and so forth. But certainly, I would consider a lot of this to be first and foremost a personal journey of self-discovery.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, if we can't see those things as reflections of ourselves and parts of ourselves to kind of use as a chemistry set to alter ourselves for the better, the more ideal regarding our own opinions of ourselves and so forth, we are going to be barking mad. If all we do is try to point the finger at the external controllers or whatever and can never get a successful mirror back to change or at least analyze parts of ourselves, I think that's the quickest way to just obsess over the other until you have a civil war. You think the only way to do something is to get those people, whatever that means.
Yeah. Well, that's part of the divide and schismogenesis again, that instills in us a reaction. I mean, I used to say, the first website I ever had said there is a worldwide conspiracy to create the belief in a worldwide conspiracy. So it's as though there's a conspiracy to divide us and conquer us, but the deepest level, or one of the deepest levels, is for those of us who are discovering the conspiracy, that will then continue with the divide and conquer thing, because we will only be able to interpret it as an us and them situation, where there are these conspirators who are plotting to ruin our lives and have been successful, and if we can only get rid of them, our lives will be great again. That's, paradoxically, that's part of the plot, to get us to perceive it through the very lens that we've been given by the conspirators to see what they're doing with, if that was grammatically correct and if it was coherent as a sentence.
Yeah, I think some of that is to also create divide and argument between those of us that care to look and care to tread in the darkness, hopefully long enough to kind of understand what's going on externally or what's going on with ourselves. It's between those of us that feel that motivation and those of us that are just much better at living, those of us that just want to have experiences and be free and live in the moment and do things that aren't at all affected or informed by the conspirators. And so it'll, just like the Democrat Republican thing and the whole football team obsession this country has, it's one more way to say, well, we're all going to go drinking at this bar. Don't invite that one guy. He's going to start talking about stuff and making us think about stuff and want our opinions and whatever. And we know we're genuinely good. We have nothing against that guy. He's our friend. But we genuinely are going to have just a better experience if we don't have to dive into any of the shadows and the things that he makes us feel responsible for, or just brings into discussion repeatedly. I'm sure the three of us have been in these situations more than we like to admit or whatever.
I was kind of saying, I think we're all three of us in this chat are probably that one guy.
Yeah, totally. That's what I meant. I wasn't trying to be too direct or hurtful to us, but yeah.
No, and I'm quite resigned to that. I'm autistic anyway, or I used to identify as that, so I'm quite fine with not being invited to the bar. So what concerns me more is is among ourselves. There's division as well. So I know a number of people who read my work and they like what I do and they support it and so on. But there are definitely areas that we could get into where we could disagree to the point even of falling out, for sure. And one of the things I've noticed that is a real flashpoint here, and I wanted to bring this up for Steve, even when I was thinking about this conversation as a question. The question being, do you consider yourself as a conspiracy researcher or even a conspiracy theorist? Because that one word, conspiracy, it's amazing. I listen to like James Howard Kunstler, for example. He's somebody I listen to the podcast. I've been on his podcast. He's been on mine. I like him. I think he's considered right wing just because he says a lot of politically incorrect things, but that's neither here nor there. But what is relevant to me is that he occasionally will say, I don't do conspiracy. I don't go there with conspiracy. He will dismiss the idea of conspiracy, and yet much of what he talks about is about the conspiratorial aspects of the world. He's read Vice of Kings. He endorsed it. And that's all about deep level, deep state, dark state conspiracies, right? But somehow he's chosen to identify as somebody who doesn't do conspiracy, right? So there's so much around that. And it isn't just the word, the fact it's been hijacked by the CIA and media and all that. It isn't only that. It's also there's a particular kind of perspective that is associated with conspiratorial thinking. I mean, obviously, nutty, lunatic, fringe, tinfoil hat at one end is extreme, and then a little further along, but still close to that end, is right wing and so on. But even if you get more nuanced, it's seen as a sort of philosophical. I mean, like someone told me recently, Vice of Kings was good, but you put too much attention on the Fabian Society. There's no way that people, conspiracy could be that efficient. Because people to be that good at what they did would have to be virtuous. That was his perspective, right? So he was taking a kind of philosophical objection. And the last thing he said was, you just don't want to take responsibility. So he's correlating my perspective, which isn't overtly conspiratorial. I'm very clear in that book. It's more about complicity than conspiracy. But there are also conspiracies, right? But yeah, he interpreted it as this very personal psychological trait as a way to explain it, right? And I mean, that's a bit of a trope, isn't it? People believe in conspiracy because it reassures them that somebody's in control and so on and so forth. But he's not like that. He's a very intelligent person, but somehow he's got this resistance to the perspective that he associates with conspiratorial thinking. So I'm curious with Steve, and because you don't theorize much, you present massive swaths of evidence for conspiracy or whatever. I mean, see, I don't even want to use the term, but very organized movements of players and money and etc. So I don't have to tell you what you do. Someone could just call you a conspiracy theory in a positive way or a negative way, either way, right? But you don't really talk much about conspiracy directly because you don't really need to, I suppose. Well, I don't want to answer your question for you. You don't.
That's all right. I mean, I tended to consider myself more of a historian above all things. I always kind of saw myself as a chronicler of, these different factions and so forth. But I don't really have a problem with the notion of conspiracy. I mean, obviously, I think to be an effective historian, you have to embrace conspiracy to a certain extent. I mean, there have been many historical precedences of conspiracies that have greatly shaped the world and so forth. So, yes, I mean, I've always tried to avoid really drawing conclusions. I mean, certainly, as you were saying, there's always a bias in your work, no matter what. I mean, everybody has a perspective. You can't help by being shaped by the things that you've experienced in your life and so forth. But just my own kind of personal style, I usually would try to just chronicle different evidence and so forth of events, individuals, and what have you, and then try to step back and, let the reader come to their conclusions about it. I mean, I have my conclusion, certainly, but I don't like to try to impose my viewpoint on people. I think that was more of my reluctance and why I try to let the readers come to their own conclusions. But certainly I would say that I would, at least privately, be considered a conspiracy theorist. I mean, I do have my own interpretation on everything that I've written about, but I do believe firmly that people should be able to draw their own conclusions from the material that I present. And, I would kind of prefer them to do their own, take their own initiative, make their own decisions about that, because hopefully that will spur them to start doing their own research and so forth as well.
Mm.
I think one of the prime examples you can use, I think Stephen is a great example. I think a few years ago, or before TTSA, I would have pointed people to Sinister Forces or Lavenda, but I have a much, much more sure example, and that's what would somebody say about David Paulides, or Paulides? The man doesn't draw any conclusions, has a law enforcement background, has written 6 books and given hundreds of lectures, but he literally only shares the facts of what happens when someone disappears, particularly in national parks or urban areas where he's found the largest pattern of vanishing people. And he cuts out like 15 bullet items before he begins to investigate. So if there's any mental health problems, if there's any leftover residue of an animal attack, if there's anyone that goes out in a national park and has no experience outdoors, or they don't know the area well, if there's people that are unarmed, if there's people that are so old that you're likely to conclude they just fell in a river somewhere or whatever. So he cuts all those out and then goes with the experienced hunters who are with 3 of their best friends, shotguns on their own property, and those type of cases, and someone vanishes and their clothes are left nicely folded 12 miles from the area where they disappeared, or their body is left face up in a body of water that some 2,000 military and otherwise emergency management type people had just searched for weeks and weeks. So everything he's talking about is a conspiracy. It's a mystery we can't begin to explain, but he refuses to share even his own ideas or opinions about what it might be. He's just showing the evidence of all these people vanishing, and we can't begin to explain it. It's definitely a conspiracy. There's a guy with a law enforcement background only giving you the facts. And I would ask someone, what do you call that? And they'd probably refuse to use the term conspiracy, but then they'd just say something like mystery or something. So it's like, it's reporting the facts, just like Stephen's saying with history. I think we've just run into a gigantic problem with the past decade and a half of the internet, turning what the CIA wanted to turn the term conspiracy theorist into tinfoil hat, anyone questioning the death of JFK, etc. It's now been turned into, you have this adrenal need to have related to a belief system whereby you need to think for your own emotional reasons that human beings have this much control over, our own past or future or worldview or whatever. What we're talking about is conspiracies. It's really just doo-dooing that term over so many years that now we're reluctant to use it, and the people we speak to might be reluctant to listen after they think we're going in that direction.
Well, but even if we don't use the term, that's the thing, is it can be used against us.
Yeah.
Yes, no, I know I've had a lot of experiences where I've tried to explain my blog to people, and they're just kind of at the end of the conversation like, oh, so you're a conspiracy theorist, huh? Oh, okay.
Right. So you don't do any work. So you just start tying together aliens to assassinations to mind control. And I mean, that's what they mean, they're not assuming your blog is what it is.
Well, I wouldn't assume that you know what they mean either, because again, it's not a big blob, is it? I mean, that's what they're attempting to create with schismogenesis. Right. Is really just get people to huddle together into points of view, and then they're easy to herd. And to some extent, it is effective, that method. But still, even a blob is made up of individuals, and any kind of interpretation of what we do is coming from an individual or a collection of individuals. So I think there are different reasons. There definitely are different reasons why people dismiss conspiracy. That's my point. Some of them think they know what it is and think it's all ridiculous. Some of them think they know what it is and think it's all just too dark. and so on. And at the subtler levels, I found that they're not always wrong, that someone isn't always wrong to dismiss. I mean, certainly case by case, someone isn't wrong to dismiss Alex Jones, although I don't think one should dismiss a disinformation agent, if I'm going to call him that, or whatever. I mean, let's say, for the sake of argument, Alex Jones is 100% disinfo shill. One doesn't want to dismiss that either, because obviously that's significant. But where was I going with this? So yeah, there's a subtler reason to question conspiratorial thinking, because often it is well, what can I say? I mean, it's incomplete. Like I'm not I mean, one of the ways in which, say, what Stephen's doing, what I'm doing gets grouped together with Alex Jones or David Icke, is that people assume that if you're mapping social engineering programs, you automatically must believe there's a global conspiracy. It's all unified as one. That's one of the most obvious, simple ways that people just mash it all together, right? And so I'm very clear about that in this book I'm working on now. I don't know if there's a unified global conspiracy any more than the people who laugh at that know that there isn't. I'm just looking at the evidence as well as I can, and I don't feel any need to speculate that, actually. It's just not, it's not a relevant thing, because I know it's beyond my pay grade. It's, I'm not at that level to be able to see that far, nowhere near it. So the kind of speculation and theorizing I do is more about trying to understand a consistency of methods and of aims and goals and so on, and the efficacy of them, right? And that, yes, I was, like Stephen just copped to, I would cop to being, a classic conspiracy theorist, in the sense that I do feel that the kind of influence that hidden forces have on our lives and even our interior lives is unimaginably great. I mean, I'm almost with the Christians there in terms of it. You could just call it Satan, and then you can close the book on it, right? Unfortunately, I can't do that. I really want to understand it as something that's up here at this human level, and so on and so forth. So yeah, so there are different reasons to challenge that perspective, and they're not always bad. I imagine Stephen would agree that sometimes when we're challenged, even if it's somebody who's ignorant, the challenge is helpful to us.
Oh, absolutely.
Did you guys want to have a sequel to this episode as soon as we can? There was a lot of stuff I wanted to read of Jason's to maybe do another show. Did you guys want to do that and possibly wrap this one up so I can get to making a video out of it, and then just have a part 2? Or how do you guys feel about that?
I'm up for it, sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I did want to go over one more thing before we wrap up, though, because I thought this might be kind of fun.
Please do. Yes.
All right. Okay. So, yes, I've been reading Prisoner of Infinity. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to quite finish it. There's so much stuff I'm trying to read. But yes, you had pointed me to chapter 14, I believe it was, Jason, when we were discussing William Sims' Bainbridge in email a couple of days ago. Of course, he was a psychologist who had written a book on the processed church in the late 70s called, what was it, At Satan's Power, or something to that effect. But yeah, you have a really interesting thing in here from Willis Harmon in that chapter. And kind of going into what we were talking about, these sort of tired social tropes that we're kind of brainwashed in, to kind of ingrained into our psyche. Harmon, in a contribution for the Institute of Noetic Sciences, Psychic Research Challenged Science, had gone on to essentially try to give a new age version of the dignity of labor, so forth. Specifically said, man is given by nature a gift, the privilege of labor. Which I found to be, I know, but this is really, yeah. I mean, he basically called for radical change, a new transcendence for the capitalist classes that would essentially make work more meaningful for the laborers. And I was really struck by this, because this is extremely close to the ideology that's been promoted by some of these really extreme Christian cults, beginning with the moral rearmament movement and then continuing on to the family/fellowship, which established the National Prayer Breakfast and so forth. And of course, the Unification Church of Sun Mayan Moon, the Moonies. I'm not sure how exactly ingrained it is in their dogma, though I would imagine it would be, because I believe they try to impose 16-hour workdays or something like that on their followers. But in the case of the family and the moral rearmament movement, I mean, both of these, really came to prominence in the 1920s and the 1930s when labor strife was at its peak. And essentially, they argued that the problem wasn't with the distribution of wealth or the oppression of the workers by the capitalist classes and so forth. The real problem was that the robber barons were driven by greed. And if we could just get them to embrace God, everything would be fine, because now the laborers would be working towards God's work. And it almost seemed like this is what Harmon was trying to argue, though, instead of trying to have the capitalist classes enamored with God. Essentially, it was with new societal progressive changes or something to that effect. But more or less, it's the same principle. It's like, no, there's no problem with the laborers being exploited by the capitalist classes. The capitalist classes just need to have the right ideology for this exploitation, and everybody will feel great. They'll have the privilege of labor. They'll be working towards what did he say? A wholesome self-image through their work. It's just incredible.
Mm-hmm. Right, and so then that ties right into Bainbridge's idea of the audience cults, of creating creating narratives that people would connect to and therefore unite around, and create these little cults, whether it's a UFO cult or the Process Church, what have you, and that those cults could over time be turned into little centers of industry, so good workers essentially.
Yes, yes, yes. No, I mean, and I think essentially Bainbridge took it to the extent that immortality, which, I mean, of course, he kind of defined as transferring your consciousness to some type of machine and then sending it into space, would ultimately be determined by your labors. Essentially, if you had done something that had advanced these kind of scientific achievements or done something that would support this culture, then you would be granted immortality. And if you didn't, well, then you would just die off. But yes, I just found this obsession with the quote unquote dignity of labor to be so curious. And of course, this is just something, especially in the United States. I mean, we've been just hammered into our psyche for years now about just the glories of work and so forth. And certainly at the time when this was coming out, I believe Harmon wrote this in the early 70s. I mean, this really kind of flew in the face of the direction that a lot of people thought that the workforce was going. I mean, by the late 50s, early 60s, there was actually a belief that in the future, we would only have to work 20 hours a week or something to that effect to support ourselves, and the rest of the time could be spent in leisure and study and so forth. And Harmon comes out and is like, no, what we really need is people to work more, but they will have meaningful work which will make their existence all the better, or so forth. So yeah, I just find that to be really incredible, that you kind of see on the one hand the Institute of Noetic Science through Harmon, and on the other hand kind of coming to the same belief system that is personified by the Unification Church and the moral rearmament movement and the family and so forth. And it just kind of goes to show that the ultimate agendas of these groups really aren't as divergent as may appear to be evident on the surface, because really they're basically trying to justify this exploitation through labor, this capitalist class looming over everybody, and not challenging it, not trying to redistribute the means of production or anything to that effect. They just want to come up with a compelling ideology that will get people to embrace their servitude as laborers, essentially.
Yeah.
And Stephen, who was the guy who came up with the theory about capitalism? I mean, much later, about capitalism being some sort of invention of AI.
Yeah, that would be Nick Land, who was big in accelerationism, and kind of was later. Some of this was incorporated into transhumanism and so forth. And that's another thing that's really interesting with Jason's book, because he really went into the influence that Bainbridge had on transhumanism, and then later some of the people affiliated with that would kind of embrace this neo-reaction / dark enlightenment ideology that Land had kind of helped craft in the late noughts, early part of this decade.
Sure. Yeah.
I think they're trying to cover as many bases as possible, and then eventually fuse them all into a single point of leverage, you could say. So I mean, it occurred to me while you were talking, Stephen, that that principle of getting people to believe that their leaders are faithful to God, and therefore if you work for the leaders, you're working for God. You could see how that could intersect with the To the Stars alien disclosure plan, as in we reveal the overlords finally, we disclose the truth about our overlords, and therefore we reveal the hidden hierarchy on the planet, which is essentially the human elite who are in service to our gods, and then the rest of you are going to work, like loving and devoted slaves for your human masters, because you know that your masters are faithful to the new god, right? That's very consistent. You can see that they may be reinventing the myths in ways that retain their usefulness, and also the intersection between transhumanism and UFO cults, which wasn't that clear when I wrote Prisoner of Infinity, even though the last part is about that intersection, has become much more clear to me with American Cosmic, because that makes it very clear that the way in which this supposed insider group of elitist scientists view the UFO is A, as a manifestation of the divine, and B, as a access to this higher technology. Right? So they're bringing the two together. They're bringing together technology and the existence of the divine, a scientific view of the divine, in the form of the UFO, which of course is the extraterrestrial, and then it's God, and then so it's quite a neat and tidy package if you look at it that way. Whether I mean, the best laid plans of mice and maniacs oft go awry. So I wouldn't want to give too much credit. I don't mean to be giving credit, but there does seem to be quite a consistent evolution of the narrative here.
May even move us to the false flag alien invasion, which I've brought up many times, but the way you just explained it is exactly how it was explained to kids in Ninja Turtles and adults in the redone version of the V series. I'm sorry, Stephen, what were you about to say?
Well, I was going to say, I mean, and that's kind of consistent with what, Bainbridge had been arguing about for some time now. I mean, essentially, he had called for the Church of God Galactic or something to that effect, in these cults that were more scientific in nature and so forth. And it really seems that kind of came to pass originally with the transhumanist movement in the late 90s, the early noughts and so forth. And then, as Jason is saying, a lot of this has kind of become intertwined with some of these UFO cults going into this decade as well. So yes, I mean, certainly it's become a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, which I suppose Bainbridge had always intended.
Yeah, it's just a question of how those two are going to be brought together, because generally the Elon Musks and the simulation believers and the transhumanists, as far as I know, aren't particularly into Hillary's UFO disclosure and John Podesta and Lavender and all that. But
well, the idea is the aliens bring us pure water and all sorts of technology and give us a few machines at a time to make our life much better so that we trust them. And in that time, they're already picking their representatives and beginning their cult. And then they sort of come along to softly reveal that they are the gods of our ancient religions, as they, give Elon Musk the patents for the next 30 years or whatever. Or at least that's the way it's explained in Ninja Turtles.
So do you think the gods of ancient religion, the old ones, will turn out to be then just the programmers of this simulation that we're finally, admitting that we're living in?
I think they're going to say that they are. I think even if they're not, they're going to use that.
And of course, they're going to make sure that we get to experience the absolute privilege of labor too.
Right.
Much as like, what is the whole thing with the Anunnaki and the human race essentially being created as a slave race to do their work for them.
Yeah, the aliens in every cartoon always come and steal the gold out the Federal Reserve because they need it to power their ships or heal their broken down physiology. And that's step one. And then step two was saying, oh, our bad. We didn't mean to steal your gold. We didn't understand it as stealing. By the way, we have a way to instantly purify water and cure cancer and etc. All right, guys. Well, did anybody else have anything else for this show? We'll wrap it up. Cool. Well, thank you guys so much for being, and thank everybody for listening. Steven, if you want to hit the dingus.